Thank you very much for coming here tonight, and thank you for your donations to this great organization, and thanks for inviting us. It's a great honor to be up here with my good friend Madeline Allbright. So thank you all for coming.
And really thank you so much. And David, it's always fun to do things with you, and I love this organization. I think it is one of the most spectacular ones in terms of what America is really about, in terms of helping. So I'm very honored to be here.
So our plan for tonight is to talk a little bit about immigration issues in the United States, refugee issues around the world. We want to talk a little bit about the rise of authoritarianism, an issue that Secretary Allbright brought up so well in her book, Fascism, which if you haven't seen, you should go out and order tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about the role of the free press in the United States. And by that time, we figure that somewhere between dessert and coffee and discussion, you will be, in one way or another, ready to go home. So, Secretary Allbright, let me start first because of all the immigration stories one hears in America, and Estella's was pretty hard to beat, I would have to say. Yours is one of the most remarkable. Tell us a little bit about how your family came here, how your dad ended up in Denver, and how you as a child ended up in Aspen.
Well, thank you, and it is hard to talk after Estelle. I think she was really, truly remarkable. Truly a theory of the case. So what happened was, I was born in Czechoslovakia in 1937, so you can all figure out how old I am. My father was a Czechoslovak diplomat, and we spent the war in England when the Nazis invaded, and I was in London during the Blitz. Then we went back, and my father became ambassador to Yugoslavia. The little girl in the national costume that gives flowers at the airport, that's what I did for a living. My father was a professional diplomat, and he got a new assignment in 1947 to be a representative on a new commission created to deal with India and Pakistan over Kashmir.
I'm glad you got that solved.
Yeah, I've always said, which proves the value of the UN. It's really a mess at the moment in every way. So what happened was he didn't want to work for the communists, and we came to the United States. And I don't have a terrible story. We came on diplomatic passports. My father, however, asked for political asylum. He defected because he couldn't go back to Czechoslovakia. And so what happened at that time, the Rockefeller Foundation was finding jobs for Central European intellectuals or something, and they found him a job at the University of Denver, and we had no idea where Denver was. And my parents bought a car and started driving across America, and so we ended up in Denver. And what happened was that when the Aspen Institute started, it used local professors as resource people. And so I've been coming to Aspen since I was 15 years old. It's changed a bit, but I love being here. And so when people ask me where I'm from, I say Colorado.
Secretary and I spent the weekend at the Aspen Strategy Group here, which is the foreign policy and national security study group for the institute that meets each year. And as I was sitting there watching Secretary Allbright, and a few steps away was Condoleezza Rice. And for those of you who don't know it, Secretary Rice, of course, was a student of Secretary Albright's father.
Can I tell the story? So what happened was, my father became a pretty big deal in Denver, and he died in 1977, and there were lots of flowers and tributes and things there. And among them was a ceramic pot in the shape of a piano with just some leaves in it. So I said to my mother, where did this come from? And she said, it's from your father's favorite student, Condoleezza Rice. She was a music major, hence the piano. Her parents were associated with the University of Denver. She took an international relations course from my father, and he persuaded her to become an international relations major. She had her master's from Notre Dame and was working on her PhD with my father when he died. So this African-American music major from Alabama was writing her dissertation on the Czechoslovak military. So in 1987, when I was working for my long list of losing Democratic presidential candidates, I was working for Michael Dukakis, and my job was to find foreign policy advisors. So I figured a woman, Soviet expert, teaches on the West Coast, so I called her up, and I asked her if she wanted to be an advisor, and she said, Madeline, I don't know how to tell you this, but I'm a Republican. And I said, Condi, how could you be? We had the same father. But the great story truly is that this Czechoslovak refugee diplomat basically trained 2 secretaries of state, and it really is a remarkable story. And the school is not anything he's on.
Trained the first 2 women secretaries.
Right,
What's the matter? He missed Hillary Clinton?
We did that another way.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So my granddaughter, when she was 7, 8 years ago, said, so what's the big deal about Grandma Maddie being Secretary of State? Only girls are Secretary of State. And now there's some boys practicing.
Yeah. So, as you say...
I do have to tell, because Estelle told such a great story about...
She did, so you've been telling...
Mix up in language. So
Yeah.
my parents spoke English, but my mother got everything wrong in terms of every idiomatic word. So I was home from college, and the phone rings very early in the morning, and my mother says, my father's name was Joe, Yoshko, Yoshko, Mrs. Dittman has died, call her son. So so my father gets on the phone, he calls Mr. Dittman and says, I'm so sorry to bother you, but your mother has died. So 2 minutes later, my mother comes storming back in, and she said, Yoshko, Yoshko, she's not dead. So then my father calls Mr. Dittman and said, I'm so sorry to bother you, but your mother has not died. My mother had gotten passed out and passed away mixed up. So this is what I grew up with.
You had one other really good one for you.
Well, my mother, again, so what happened, I was, again, at home at some point, and there was somebody that had phoned, and they were trying to sell her a subscription, and she said, I don't want it, because by then I will belong in the underground. So, always something with... But my father, when we came here, he wanted to fit in Colorado, which means fishing. The only problem is that he fished in a coat and tie, and it was really embarrassing when we were at Maroon Bells, and he was all dressed up, and he did catch a fish, and he also had an accent, and as we all know, the echo chamber up there, he said, I got one, and then every teenage boy up there who heard it kept yelling, I got one.
Well, I can tell you, I was up at Maroon Bells this morning, and I didn't get one, so I would have been happy to say it that way. We're at a remarkable moment about immigration in this country. I didn't think that I would necessarily be covering a government that was as openly hostile as this one seems to be now. And if you just take a look at the overall numbers, and I was looking at this today, we brought in a record small number of refugees to the United States in the past year. I think only about 23,000 came in. And those numbers have traditionally been up around 80,000 a year. The president said a couple of weeks ago, the nation is full. And this organization has talked so much about immigrant stories, but I cover the intersection between foreign policy and technology, and to go out in Silicon Valley is to live with one phenomenal immigrant story after another, from Google to Intel to so many others. So what is it in the country that you think has turned so that we've gone from the concept of a nation of immigrants to the concept of a nation that is full?
It's interesting that you mentioned that the president said the country is full. So I did have to do a tweet, and I said, the country is not full, and the Department of Homeland Security is empty. They have really dismantled everything that is going on. And I think I'm trying to figure out, by the way, I think it's passing strange, since he actually, having been married a number of times, twice to immigrants who bring their families over, which is called chain immigration. And that he absolutely doesn't get it. I do think...
I was around for the day that someone asked Sarah Sanders earlier this year after Melania Trump's parents got citizenship, whether they were an example of chain migration. Right. We're still waiting for the answer from the White House to that question. Yeah.
But I do think, I'm trying to sort out what really has happened, because we have been a generous country. I do believe that every country has a right to have its immigration laws. I mean, that is part of sovereign right. And we were talking about this at dinner. We need to have a comprehensive immigration bill that deals with the security of the border, and then also has some kind of a system so that people can come in legally. It has been difficult in a number of ways, because there have been really a lot of people that have immigrated recently, some from the Middle East, some from North Africa, some due to climate change, and some obviously from Latin America. And I think that what has happened is that the openness of America has been under pressure, because there are people at the top of the government that are blaming the immigrants for everything. And we are living in a very peculiar time in terms of divisions in society. There are questions about jobs. And you already, if I may say so, mentioned my book. It has a very bland title, Fascism: A Warning. And what we've seen in the past, and I went back and looked at things historically, is that when there are economic divisions in a society, a leader who is trying to show his power in terms of authoritarian leadership, the way Mussolini did, allies with one group at the expense of another, and the other becomes the scapegoat. And so I do think that that's one of the things that really has happened. The best quote in the book comes from Mussolini, which says, if you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices. So there's a lot of feather plucking going on now, and you can't say those two words together too quickly.
So it's interesting, though, that the moment has come now. And usually when you see this rise of authoritarianism, it's in a moment of tremendous economic stress. So if we think about the rise of fascism between the wars, obviously in Germany, they've just been through a settlement of World War I that set Germany back dramatically and gave rise, obviously, to Hitler. That's not the situation that we have seen here in the United States, or even for the backlash to the acceptance of refugees in Germany now. Both economies, the American economy and the German economy, were fundamentally running on all cylinders at the time this came up. So if you were a political scientist looking at the conditions that would likely give rise to this, I've noticed that, yes. You might not predict that this would be the moment.
Yeah.
So
I think what is interesting is that this is something, as I've kind of, from my political science vantage point, have said basically that there are two mega trends with their downside. Globalization is a mega trend that most of the people here, have benefited from. But it does have a downside. It's faceless. And so people want to know what their identities are in terms of religion, linguistics, ethnic background, which is fine, because that can be patriotic. But if my identity hates your identity, you get hyper-nationalism, and the last thing you want is a bunch of foreigners there. And Europe is a very good example of this. So one country, for instance, Hungary, Hungary has lived with a sense of having been not treated properly at the end of World War I did a survey right after the fall of the wall, and I did it all over Europe, and we asked the question of people everywhere, do you think a piece of your country is in the neighboring country? And I'll never forget the Hungarian numbers. 80% people thought that there were people living that their neighbors actually were had a right to be part of Hungary. So they are the ones that began this kind of thing as the people were coming through Greece and wanted to get into Western Europe, that created these scapegoats, even though the Hungarians forgot how generous people were to them in 1956. And then as they spread into Europe, where things were going well, there is always somebody that will point that those kind of nationals are the ones that are at fault for this. And somehow the economic aspect of this is that it has only benefited the top. And one of the things I've always liked to talk to you about is basically why we weren't ready to deal with technology, because it keeps moving, and it really was like the Industrial Revolution, and people did lose their jobs, and I think that's when the scapegoat part came in.
I think technology has certainly contributed to losing the jobs. Probably far more jobs have been lost in the United States because of technology than because of immigration by any means. But I think the other thing was that we convinced ourselves somehow or another that the spread of technology, the spread of the internet, would somehow undercut authoritarian governments, make people recognize the benefits. During the administration you served in, President Clinton, I remember going to China with him on many occasions, in which he would usually wind up his trip with a visit to Beijing University, and a speech that basically said, the more and more that we see the internet spread throughout China, the more it will undercut the Communist Party. Because authoritarians cannot survive a world of free information and a world of seeing how others live. And it turned out that he and many others, and I certainly was guilty of this myself, got it wrong. That it turned out that that technology became the great tool of authoritarians and a tool of nationalists.
There's no, I mean, it's like having created Frankenstein in many ways, because it has a double face on it. One of the other mega trends I talk about is technology and its downside. So technology actually was democratizing, we thought, and it also helped. I love to always talk about the Kenyan woman farmer who no longer had to walk zillions of miles to pay her bills. She could do it with a mobile phone. But what it also did was to really divide people. Everybody had their own source of information. Very difficult. The Arab Spring, we had something that was a product of that. But basically, I don't think we focused on the capability of technology to provide so much information about people that they lost their privacy and their right to operate. And in fact, we're able to track people, and now in China do facial recognition. So it became a tool of authoritarians. And the question, I'm chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute, and we kept talking about the democratization of information, but what it has done is help to create a control of certain information. Or on the refugees, one of the things that I've been a part of is trying to figure out whether technology can help the refugees in terms of trying to prove who they are, which it can do, but at the same time it also is capable of providing a lot of information that can be used against people. So I think it is kind of a Frankenstein kind of gift in many ways.
Well, certainly it is double-edged. I thought some of the most interesting conversation that we had at the session with Secretary Rice and Secretary Allbright, all that, was about how we are headed toward a world of fundamentally two internet societies. One built around authoritarianism, which the Chinese help you with by exporting that facial recognition package with your next 5G networks, and one that is the chaotic, frequently abused but fundamentally free internet society that we know. And it does provide a great opportunity for people, particularly immigrants to countries, to find each other and create community. But it certainly helps in the world of authoritarian control. And I don't see a whole lot of discussion of that within the US government, particularly from an administration that fundamentally has admired a lot of the authoritarian leaders who we've seen come in. Again, something I don't think we would have predicted when you were serving as secretary.
No, and I think it's obviously the most unfortunate aspect because I think there are a lot of changes in societies throughout the world in terms of living conditions and climate change and the need for new technology. But to all of a sudden see it as something that undermines our state system and is used in the opposite way, I think is something to really worry about. When I wrote my book, I was trying to figure out really what was going on, and the term fascist is thrown around without people understanding what it means. If you disagree with somebody, that person is a fascist. Or in fact, if a teenage boy is not allowed to drive, his father's a fascist. And so it's a term, it's not an ideology, it is a process for gaining power. And that's why I decided to go back and look at the history of it. And, by the way, we were talking about Mussolini and Hitler, they came to power constitutionally. And when I wrote about Hungary and Turkey and the Philippines and Venezuela, all those leaders were elected. And so I think what are the characteristics? And one, as I already mentioned, it's identifying with one group at the expense of another. The second is to make sure that the judiciary is not independent. And the third is you do know that you're an enemy of the people.
I keep reading that, yeah.
You know, and the idea that information and the press is the basis of a democratic government, and yet all of a sudden it is being seen as an enemy, I think is one of the things that worries me the most about this admiration of authoritarians, because information is really something that keeps a society lubricated and interested, and what's happening in a number of the countries that I talk about is that information is being questioned as to its validity and how it is being used. And if you begin to talk about it as an enemy of the people, it undermines democracy and gives strength to authoritarian leaders.
You know, the rise, Secretary Allbright, of two phrases, fake news, which has been completely redefined in the past 3 years, and then the enemy of the people, has been two things I don't think I had ever expected to see in several decades as a journalist. If you just go back 3 or 4 years, just prior to President Trump's election, the phrase fake news was usually used to describe what Pravda used to do and what RT does now, and what was so familiar to you from what you saw in Europe as a child, where you try to make sure that the main instruments of media are repeating the tale that the government wants to tell you or the leader wants to tell you. Somehow President Trump managed to flip the phrase so that he used it for any kind of news that he disagrees with. Some of which may well be fake, but the majority of which, if you go back and take a look at his use of the phrase, turned out to be stories that, as you read the Mueller report, turned out to be true, by and large. I would say probably a 90 or 95% hit rate. The enemy of the people phrase is something different. I can live with the president or anybody else saying we're fake news. I think our record stands for ourselves, and would say the same for other mainstream media. Enemy of the people begins to send a message to people that fundamentally this is not a part of our democracy, but an outside force. I think can lead to violence. I mean, the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, which I've been in for 25 years now, this year for the first time got its first ballistic doors and armed guards. I've never worked in a newsroom behind ballistic glass and armed guards. But more importantly, I think what has happened with this is that it's been intended to so cast doubt about even true news stories that the president feels, and his supporters feel, we hear this frequently, that you can question any piece of reporting, no matter how deep, no matter how true, simply by shouting the words that it was fake news written by enemy of the people. And that's a change. You know, when I was White House correspondent when you were secretary, you and I had a couple of moments, right?
Yes.
Okay. If you've never been on Madeline Allbright's bad side, the story you've written, I can tell you, it's not a pleasant place to be. Okay. But I remember, you know, one incident that actually started from reporting here in Aspen. It was 20 years ago this summer when I reported on a secret North Korean nuclear site that your colleagues had neglected to tell very many people in Congress about. And it ran opposite the argument that the Clinton administration was making, that they had frozen the North Korean program. And you got dragged off to give some classified testimony on this. And I remember that you and I had one conversation that I think in Washington we would refer to now as a frank and clear exchange of views. But I always thought as I was coming out of it that you fundamentally understood we had very different jobs within the constitutional system. And I don't think you ever questioned for a moment our right to publish it, even though it was classified information.
No question about it, and I do think that democracy depends on a press that can, in fact, inform the people. Back in terms of my own work, I wrote my dissertation on the role of the Czechoslovak press during the Prague Spring, which was interesting because the people had been reading the communist press. They kind of knew what the truth was from Radio Free Europe and gossip. And so all of a sudden when it became uncensored, everything changed. Or in Poland, the Solidarity movement. So I've always been very interested in the role of the press. And it is the fourth estate. I mean, the bottom line is your job is something very different from that of the government. And the government benefits by, in fact, having that kind of reporting and trying to deal with it. Now, what is hard, and the North Korean situation was particularly hard, is how little information, this is a terrible thing to admit, how little information we had about what was going on in North Korea. One of the things that I have believed for a long time, we need to have embassies even in countries that we don't like, because it is the eyes and ears of your government. I did go to North Korea. At the time, I was the highest level American representative to have ever gone. We had no idea what was going on.
You would remain the highest level until the president stepped into the DMZ a few months ago.
That's true, yes. But I think I get there, I had no idea what to do. We had been told not by you, but that basically Kim Jong-il, the father of the current president, chairman, was crazy and a pervert. And what happened, he wasn't crazy. So, and it was interesting to try to sort out what was going on there and what they were lying about and what they weren't. And frankly, I think the kind of reporting that you did, while embarrassing at the time in terms of having been privately or secretly briefed, turns out to be very important. And I do think that if our country gives up the role of a free press, then we really are totally going down the wrong. And I have, not just because we know each other and because I read you all the time, I really do think you represent a profession that is absolutely essential for a democracy to function.
Thank you. It's a nice thing to hear, and I thank you for the applause, but it's also been interesting in the past couple of years. It's really been the first time reporters have seen people come up and say, thank you for what you're doing for the democracy. Until that time, I think it was mostly something that people sort of read about in civics class, but didn't feel, and I think have felt it in recent times. There is a risk on the other side, though, and it's interesting. It came up out of a truly bad headline that we had in the New York Times earlier this week when the president went to El Paso, and I think the first edition headline in the print edition, some of you may remember we used to publish the New York Times on paper.
Yeah.
It would get dropped on your doorstep. Quaint tradition, but and in the first edition they had a headline that basically said, I can't remember the exact words, but a president denounces racism and so forth, and it didn't have the skeptical air that a second edition headline did. And it wasn't part of a conspiracy, it was part of somebody on deadline writing a headline quickly and not enough people looking at it. And that happens more often than it should, given the fact that you have to write so many headlines for so many different editions, electronic and non. But what was interesting was a big uprising on the part of largely liberals who charged that the New York Times was basically backing President Trump by writing this. And that started a huge debate on Twitter for the, that 0.001% of the American population that spends too much time on Twitter. But it was an interesting reaction because I think there is also a sense that while on the one hand journalism is supposed to be doing just what you described, that the Times, the Post, and others should be part of what many on the left call the resistance. And I actually think that's exactly the wrong role for us. That there's a huge risk at a moment that you're in contention with the government each and every day, and we are, that you not let yourself become part of the resistance, that you're part of what American journalism is supposed to be, which is fact-finding, investigation, aggressive reporting, but not partisan reporting.
But I think what is hard these days is just generally, and I hate to say this because it makes me seem a relativist, to find out what the truth really is. And so I read, by the way, I begin the morning because I get up very early, so I read on my iPad, but because I believe in paper newspapers, I still take them all at home. So, but I read the Times, I read the Washington Post, I read the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times. And what is interesting is to see somewhat of a difference in it, and I do think it is the responsibility of the reader to read critically and try to figure out how they fit together in a number of ways, just as it is your responsibility to find the facts. But facts are sometimes hard to find.
Yeah, I've noticed, yeah.
And the part that's interesting is the way people get their information. So for instance, to go back in Egypt during when people came to Tahrir Square, they were motivated to go there by social media. And they get there with different kinds of information. Political parties couldn't be formed, and it's very hard to kind of figure out where they were going. And so it's much more complicated in every way. And when you are attacked by the President of the United States and the group of people around him, it then undermines even more what is already a difficult job. And I don't think the press needs to quote the resistance. The press has to tell us what you find. It may change over the 24 hours in terms of some of the facts because things change, but I think we count on the press to give us facts as best you possibly can.
You mentioned social media and what we learned from the Arab Spring. It was really a remarkable moment because we learned that social media can be very good at tearing a government down quickly. Think how many fell, everyone except Assad, basically, right? But it's terrible at actually building the government back up. It doesn't create the cohesiveness that you need to form something. And Secretary Clinton, your successor a few times removed, commented on this. I remember going to talk to her after her first trip to Egypt after the Arab Spring. And she had gathered together the people who had done such a brilliant job bringing down the Mubarak government and asked them, so now what are you going to build up? And they said, that's not our responsibility, right? If we don't like the next government, we'll tear it down too. Well, by the time the next government came along, which was a military government that was much harder than Mubarak's, there was no social media flying around to tear it down.
You know what's interesting about, because I talk about this a lot, what happened, I do believe in elections, but I actually think the decision to hold the election in Egypt came too soon. The Muslim Brotherhood was organized and the Tahrir Square people were not. So Cairo was a mess. I made up this story of a middle-aged man who actually wanted to come into Cairo to open his stall in the marketplace. Cairo was screwed up and he says, to hell with this, I want order. And then he gets a military government. And so the evolution of democracy is not easy. And the timing of it is something that I think people need to think about. But we are, no matter what, would be going through a complicated period in terms of the rapidity of information and I do both when I was in the government and now, and I tell my students the first information when you're in the government, the first information that comes in is wrong. And so the question is how you make decisions. But David, I was just thinking, one of the things when you were talking, I think people need to know what it's like when you're Secretary of State to travel with the press. So what happens is there's an airplane. I did have my own airplane, and the press went with me. So, and you walk back and forth, and you have nice conversations, or you bring somebody up to the cabin to have a conversation. Then you get off the plane, and the people that you've just spent a nice time with are standing there yelling at you all of a sudden. And you think, why did I bring these people on this trip? So then it's unpleasant. Then you all go to dinner and it's all nice again. And then there's another press conference. So it's a rather peculiar relationship. And some of the people I actually got to know pretty well, and they still yelled at me.
It's part of our training program. Yeah. It's interesting. I did travel with the Secretary, but not when you were a few years later. And I traveled a lot with John Kerry during the Iran negotiations. First of all, he was always complaining about that airplane, which is 25 years old.
It wasn't bad when I was around.
Yeah. And you'll all be glad to know we all do pay our way. The government does not actually, we all insist on. So we get charged for it, and we pay an exorbitant amount of money for an economy seat, and pretty bad food. That apart, something unusual happened after President Trump was elected. So Rex Tillerson became Secretary of State. You all remember Rex Tillerson. He was, and the first thing he did was throw all those reporters off the plane. And I mentioned this one time to Secretary Kissinger, and he said, I could never have gotten away with that.
I think it is important to have the press along, no matter what. And that exchange, I also do think that it is important for policymakers to understand the role of the press and not see it, not just, we don't have to go as far as the enemy of the people, but to kind of see that interchange and how you articulate what you're trying to do makes a difference.
Well, I've noticed in these, and you're right, the yelling happens because everybody needs something, or the TV folks need something that's on tape. But the most interesting conversations that take place on that airplane or in the hotels when you're traveling it's the moment just truly tasked with the secretary and with their senior leadership, what their priorities really are. So if somebody's going to China and you're not hearing about human rights, or going to Venezuela and you're not hearing about human rights, it's an interesting measure. If you're traveling with the secretary, as my colleagues and I have done, to Saudi Arabia right after the killing of Khashoggi, and they're meeting with MBS, the Crown Prince, who we believe there's significant evidence may well have been implicated in the killing, it raises the interesting question, what message are you sending by meeting with them? I wanted to just conclude by taking the immigration discussion we were having back to this small presidential election that seems to be coming along. And it's interesting that immigration came up in the Democratic debates in several forms, and that Elizabeth Warren and Secretary Castro and others were all discussing basically decriminalizing illegal immigration coming over the border, turning it into something for which you get more of a fine than anything else. And I'm wondering what your view is for the Democratic Party, your party, about taking a position that would certainly open up the question of whether or not the United States now has open borders, which is certainly the way that will be cast in the election when it finally comes down to two candidates.
Well, a minute ago I kind of said that I thought that we needed a comprehensive legislation because there really is, as I said, every country has a right to do this. We do want secure borders. We also want people to come in legally. We are a country of laws. The question is what you do with some of the people that have been here and they're the dreamers and a variety, and then the problem of every administration doing it slightly differently. And our people that have come in illegally put in line and be ahead of those that have come in legally. So there are a number of different questions. I am somewhat troubled by the decriminalization because it does raise all these questions. But it leads me to say, what I've just said is we have to have some kind of legislation. What I find fascinating, I have spent a lot of time on the whole issue of refugees. So I was in Jordan and went to a refugee camp, and there were people trying to come to the United States. And at that time, I met with the King of Jordan, and he was saying, you know, we have as many people in these camps. It would be as if the United States all of a sudden had 20 million new refugees. So then I saw him later, and I said, I quote you, Your Majesty, all the time. He said, no, you're wrong. It's now as if the United States had 60 million refugees, and Jordan is a frontline state. And so we're not dealing with the variety of issues. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of the U.S. government as a setup are executive-legislative relations. And when Congress cannot act, and you have a president who thinks the country is full, then I can understand why there are different kinds of solutions coming out there. But there's no answer to this unless, in fact, we develop comprehensive legislation which makes people feel that we are doing things legally. But I actually do think, I have said that I'm very glad the political season has begun because there are so many issues out there that need to be discussed. And if I may say something negative about the press, I do think that the way those debates have been carried on does not give a lot of credibility to the moderators if you are supposed to raise your hand and say whether you are for decriminalizing. There are more complicated issues, and I think we have to figure out how to actually have a debate that raises not only those issues, but all the others.
I think one way to do it is, and it's a hard thing to do and sustain people's attention, is you have to do this in smaller groups. When you put that many candidates on the stage at one time, it leads the moderators to do things like you just suggested, and it leads the candidates to leap for the one-liner that will get remembered the next day. And, you know, it is such a difference between what you get in a debate and what you get in a one-on-one interview. I was sent off to do the first foreign policy interviews with then candidate Donald Trump with my colleague Maggie Haberman. And, you know, we were able to drill into this for 2 hours with him. Sort of an interesting experience doing foreign policy for 2 sessions of 2 hours each with Donald Trump. But what was interesting was the consistency of his view. I mean, the stories that came out of those, we were able to surface views that have been exactly the way he has ended up governing, that you did not get from the debates. And I think one of the things I'd like to see, and something that we're trying to do a lot more at the Times, is to give those in-depth moments. It gets easier as the field narrows. So leave us with this last thought. Tell us when English in Action does its next benefit next year and tries to beat the donation levels that happened this year, where do you think we are going to be in the political world? We're going to be just 4 months out from the election. What do you think the economy is going to look like? What do you think the debate's going to look like?
Well, I think the economy may be in good shape for some people, but not for everybody. And I think the question will be, to what extent do we have an economy that is fair to the people? And I hope there is a discussion about that. I have made up my mind I'm not going to get involved until we have a candidate, and I'm looking forward to that, frankly. But I do think it's unclear because the world is a mess. That's a diplomatic term of art. And we had a lot of discussions about U.S.-China relations and how they impact domestic policy with the trade issues. And I think that I'm hoping that our populations are going to be able to absorb all the stuff that's coming out. I'm sorry that there's not more discussion already about foreign policy. And I do think that we need to understand how foreign policy impacts domestic policy and how our behavior domestically is affecting other countries in terms of democracy. By the way, to go back to Egypt, when I was there before the arrests and things, I was talking with some Egyptian members of parliament, and I said, you know, it's very important to build coalitions and compromise. And they said, you mean like you guys? So we are not a very good example, but I can't predict what's going to happen because things are moving in a strange way. But if I can conclude on a refugee note, I am a refugee. I did not become an American citizen until between my sophomore and junior year in college. It hadn't occurred to me since I'd gone to school in Denver that I was viewed as a foreign student. So I've been talking to some younger students who seem to know what their scores are on SATs and everything, and when I went to find out what I'd gotten, my dean said, remarkable, and I didn't know whether it was meant that she thought I was a foreign student and didn't speak English, or that they were. But the bottom line is I am a very grateful American, and I was sworn in as a citizen in Denver, and I am grateful. And the story, I loved being Secretary of State for any number of reasons, but one was that I was able to give naturalization certificates to people. And the first time I did it was on July 4th, 2000 at Monticello. And I figured I could do it since I had Thomas Jefferson's job. So I was giving a certificate, and I gave this man one, and I heard him say, can you believe that I'm a refugee and I just got my naturalization certificate from the Secretary of State? And I heard him, and I went up to him and I said, can you believe that a refugee is Secretary of State? And
Thank you, Secretary Allbright. Always great to be with you, and thanks to English in Action for having us up here tonight.
Thank you very much.